we are doing identifying assumptions questions for critical reasoning. This is the first verbal chapter on the TTP curriculum. So this one, compared to some of my other CR things, might be a little bit more intro-y just because this is very foundational. So FYI on that. But mostly it will be what we usually do. I will go through, I will kind of describe the topic, and then we will do some practice questions together. Feel free, if you have questions, drop them in the chat and I will address them. And we will also have time at the end. So let's start with what are assumptions. This is information that the author's conclusion relies on that isn't explicitly stated in the argument. It could be obvious, it could be subtle, it could be something that you think goes without saying, but anything that has gone without saying is vulnerable to criticism. So there are lots of assumptions in even very basic arguments, and it is good to get a feel for like noticing them. And then we will work through 6 example questions and you will get roughly 2 minutes, and then we will review them together. This is the main thing. Assumptions are the only place that we can really poke holes in an argument because of the way critical reasoning works. So critical reasoning rules are assumptions, or supporting evidence is irrefutable. It is 100% true. We cannot question it. And conclusions are obviously opinions. And so we can only weaken arguments through assumptions. We can only strengthen arguments through like addressing assumptions or gaps in the argument. And of course, with assumptions, we are looking for necessary assumptions. So any assumption that we have that is necessary, the conclusion would not be able to follow from the premises if it wasn't true. And then let's start with our first example. I have a poll that I will open. Okay, this one's a very simple argument, and we are going to go through it. I will read it, I will break it down, and then we can kind of see an example of straightforward sort of assumptions. So, side-by-side tests of fruits and vegetables grown using conventional and organic methods have found no significant differences between the levels of key nutrients in the conventionally grown produce and the levels of those nutrients in the organically grown produce. Thus, there is no reason to believe that there is any health benefit to be derived from eating organically grown produce rather than conventionally grown produce. So, what is our premise? The level of key nutrients between these two types of produce is the same. And the conclusion is that there's no reason to believe that there's any health benefit to be derived from eating organically grown produce instead of conventionally grown produce. Notice that we are specifically talking about health benefit in the conclusion, so keep that in mind. A, fruits and vegetables that are grown using organic methods do not taste different from those grown using conventional methods. We're not talking about taste. We are talking about health benefits, so irrelevant. B, plants take in nutrients from the soil as a necessary aspect of their growth processes. This one is what I call like a timeline mismatch. So we're talking about the health benefits to ostensibly human people eating produce. We're not really worried about what happened when the plants were growing. We are at a different stage in their life cycle, the consumption stage. So that one is a bit out of scope on time. C, conventionally grown produce does not contain significant levels of health-harming chemicals that organically grown produce does not contain. So if we take this one and we negate it and say conventionally grown produce does contain significant levels of health-harming chemicals that organically grown produce does not contain, then even if there is no significant differences between the levels of key nutrients, conventional versus organic, the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from that. Like, imagine if you have like one apple and then one apple is covered in arsenic. Even if they have the same nutrients, they are not, you would definitely expect some health benefits relative to the arsenic apple with the plain apple. So C is a necessary assumption. D, the differences between the prices of most organically grown produce and those of most conventionally grown produce are not justified. We aren't talking about price here, we're talking about health benefits. And E, the methods used in farming organically grown produce tend to be more labor intensive than those used in farming conventionally grown produce. That's a little bit out of scope too. We're not talking about labor efforts. We're simply talking about health benefits. So, do we all feel pretty good about that one? It was C. It looks like we mostly agree. Awesome, awesome. All right. Are assumptions binary? Typically, yes, and you will notice that in the writing a lot of the time. So this is a good example of the phrasing here feels a bit like try hard, like it's a little bit heavy-handed phrasing, but a lot of times because an assumption to be necessary, if we negate it, it's got to make the conclusion no longer follow. It has to be pretty narrow. And so what this says, conventionally grown produce does not contain significant levels of health harming chemicals that organically grown produce does not contain. There has to be a way to negate that to cover like every eventuality. So do they or do they not, right? And you will get better at seeing what I call the breaking point on assumptions, where you're like, this is how we would negate this to cover all the other possible outcomes. But they typically are binaries. Oh, I mean, weakeners say the most, which implies more than one can weaken. You won't have two necessary assumptions because we are looking specifically for necessary assumptions, which, depending on what CR prep you've done, you might hear about sufficient assumptions, but particularly GMAT and GRE, not concerned with sufficiency, only necessary. So there will only be one assumption that is critical to the argument structure. Okay. Most residents of Spring Hills lack health insurance. Blue Health, a nationwide insurance company, just announced that it will offer health insurance for a deeply discounted price to all Spring Hills residents who do not have any pre-existing conditions. Therefore, by next month, most Spring Hills residents will have health insurance. Look at our breakdown. So, background, most residents lack health insurance. So, our premise is that this company, in particular, Blue Health, is going to offer health insurance to all Spring Hills residents who do not have any pre-existing conditions at a deeply discounted rate. So by next month, most Spring Hills residents will have health insurance from somebody, not necessarily from Blue Health. Let's go through our choices. A, no other health insurance companies will follow Blue Health's lead and begin offering similar health insurance at a discounted price to residents of Spring Hills. This is a trap because it does not specify that they have to get their health insurance through Blue Health. B, it will take many months for most residents of Spring Hills to learn about the health insurance being offered by Blue Health. This is a weakener, and a weakener can never be a necessary assumption. C, being covered by health insurance is an important part of any wealth management strategy. That's more just like general advice. So it is it's on a related topic, but it's not relevant to the argument. D, Blue Health is able to offer health insurance for a deeply discounted price to Spring Hills residents because the cost of healthcare in Spring Hills is unusually low. This is a trap that explains a premise. We already know that Blue Health is going to offer this insurance at a deeply discounted price. We do not need to know why or how they're pulling that off. We trust them that they will do that. And E, most residents of Spring Hills do not suffer from at least one medical condition that Blue Health categorizes as a pre-existing condition. So with this one, if we negate it and most residents of Spring Hills do suffer from at least one pre-existing condition, then the conclusion no longer follows from the premises because they specify that it's only going to be, they're only offering health insurance for a deeply discounted price to residents who don't have any pre-existing conditions. E. Any questions about that one? That one's pretty straightforward as long as you catch that it doesn't specify where they have to get the health insurance from. Excellent. And having trouble between B and E. B is, okay, so this is something that you really have to notice. Usually in an assumption question, one answer will be a weakener. They love to throw that in. And you've just got to pay attention to the direction. So if it will take many months for residents of Spring Hills to learn about health insurance being offered by Blue Health, then the conclusion doesn't follow. If it said like it will not take many months for residents of Spring Hills to learn about the health insurance, that could be a necessary assumption. But this one, the way it's written, does weaken the argument, and a weakener can never be a necessary assumption. And so, especially with assumption questions, because of the negation test and how we like flip them to test them, you do have to the one that you have in front of you and make sure that it's going in the right direction. All right. Okay. In the country of Junipero, mangoes are being grown, processed, and shipped to markets in Junipero at the maximum possible rate of 2,000 mangoes per day. In Junipero, when demand for a good exceeds the supply of that good, the cost of that good increases. Thus, since the current level of demand for mangoes in Junipero is 3,000 mangoes per day, the price of mangoes sold in Junipero will soon increase. Which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? Let's look at our breakdown. They are already in Junipero, growing, processing, and shipping the max possible rate of mangoes, which is 2,000 per day. They also give us the premise that when demand for a good exceeds the supply of that good, the cost of the good increases. This is a classic example of how you shouldn't really need any specialized knowledge to answer critical reasoning questions. They are even explaining basic supply and demand here, just so we can make sure we're on the same page. And the current demand for mangoes is 3,000 mangoes per day, a full 50% more mangoes than they are processing, and they are at the max. So the conclusion is the price of mangoes sold in Junipero will soon increase. A, most residents of Junipero will begin to substantially reduce their mango consumption. This would weaken the conclusion because if they reduce their mango consumption, then the demand would go down and perhaps the price would not increase because demand might go down to meet the current supply. B, mango production in Junipero is limited by the relatively small number of acres available in the country for growing mangoes. This explains the premise I suppose that they are already producing them at the max of 2,000 mangoes per day. But again, we do not need to have that explained. We already have the information we need. C, almost all residents of Junipero will not begin to travel to and purchase mangoes in the nearby country of mangosteen, where mangoes are less expensive than they are in Junipero. If we negate that one, and almost all residents of Junipero can start traveling to this nearby country to mangoes where they are less expensive, then the conclusion no longer follows from the premises, because the localized demand will decrease. They're going to be traveling outside of the country to purchase mangoes elsewhere, and the price would probably not increase. D, there are other fruits sold in Junipero that have the same taste, texture, and consistency as mangoes. This one is a little bit weird because it's saying that there is perhaps like a comparable fruit. If there is, then people might just switch to that, in which case it would weaken. If they don't consider the fruit comparable, then it's irrelevant. So it definitely is not a necessary assumption. It could be a weakener or it could be irrelevant depending on how the people in Junipero perceive these other fruits. And E, over the past few months, mango farmers have developed innovative ways to increase the number of mangoes that they are able to grow per acre of farmland. This is a trap because we already know that they are producing mangoes at the maximum possible rate. So whether that is due to innovative increases or not, it doesn't matter. We know what the maximum rate is. So the best choice, I believe, is C. E is against the. You could definitely make the case that E is against the premise. It could also just be like, this is a good example of what does that mean, right? Like, is that being factored in? Is it not being factored in? This just introduces more questions than anything else. We need something that has a clear effect on the argument. So whenever people throw out just like broad statements and we can't assess a clear impact, be very dubious of that. And B, mango production in Junipero is limited by the relatively small number of acres. So this is one that is explaining the premise as well, but we already know from the first sentence that the mangoes are being produced, grown, processed, and shipped at the maximum possible rate. So why that is the maximum possible rate doesn't really matter because we already know what the maximum possible rate is. And we know that current demand exceeds the maximum possible rate as it stands. All right. Any other questions? Hi. Here is this one. Oh, C can't be the answer because, as you said, almost all the residents go to another. Yes. If the demand decreases, then so on this one, the supply is 2,000, the demand right now is 3,000. And they're saying since the current level of demand exceeds the current level of supply, the price of mangoes sold will soon increase. But if the demand lowers, then that price might not like increase in the future. So it hasn't increased to adapt to the mismatch between supply and demand yet. But whenever you're talking about demand and supply, there is also factors of like that only holds if the demand doesn't decrease. If people stop eating mangoes for whatever reason, if people get their mangoes somewhere else, if people substitute good, like this other unnamed fruit, then the demand would correct itself without a price increase. Does that help? It's against the conclusion that the price will increase, because they're saying that the demand won't lower to meet supply, but that the price will increase to cause the demand to lower. But the demand could lower on its own if people are shopping around or they find a good substitute good or whatever else. Okay, yeah, on the mango thing, basically, like, every assumption in the mango argument is saying supply is set, it cannot be increased, and demand is higher than supply. So the author is assuming that if the price is going to increase from that, that people will not address the mismatch in some other way, such as, going outside of the country. So choice C is saying that people won't do that. It's explicitly saying that, hey, people aren't just going to go next door and buy mangoes. So the conclusion can hold, because if almost all of the people did just go next door and buy mangoes, then the conclusion that the price would increase doesn't necessarily follow from the premises. If that makes sense. Let's go through this one. In a recent medical study, all of the study participants who had abused alcohol in the past 5 years were found to be suffering with depression. Thus, it must be the case that abusing alcohol causes depression. Pretty straightforward. Here are some things about cause and effect, because this is a causal relationship. Whenever an author assumes cause and effect, they are assuming that their cause leads to their effect. It is not caused by something else. Both the cause and effect are not caused by like an unstated third variable, and that the relationship isn't reversed, so they don't have it backwards. Those are important things to see. This is also an accept question, because we are looking for 4 will be necessary assumptions, and it will illustrate, I believe, all of those concepts, and then 1 will not be a necessary assumption. So both alcohol abuse issues and depression can be solved via the use of therapy, specially designed for the treatment of alcohol abuse issues. This is another timeline mismatch. We aren't talking about solving this problem. We are just saying abusing alcohol causes depression. The solution, that is a future issue. We're just talking about the cause right now. So A does not seem like a necessary assumption. B, the depression and alcohol abuse of the study participants were not both results of heavy use of illicit drugs. So what this one is saying is they were not both the cause of this specific third plausible cause. And that is a necessary assumption, because they are assuming that the alcohol abuse causes depression. C, the study participants were not found to be suffering with depression before they started abusing alcohol. This is a necessary assumption, because if it's not true, then the cause and effect are reversed. So the author is assuming this. D, the study was not set up in a way such that people who were not suffering with depression would be very unlikely to participate. So with D, if they're looking for people who had abused alcohol in the past 5 years, and they only like advertised for the study in a place where depressed people hang out, like an alcohol and depression support group, then that would skew the data, because they're saying all of the study participants who had abused alcohol in the past 5 years were found to be suffering with depression. But if they're only looking at people who are suffering with depression, then of course, like, maybe all of the people involved are suffering with depression. So the fact that the study was not set up in a way such that people who weren't depressed would be unlikely to participate is a necessary assumption. And E, the concurrence of alcohol abuse and depression seen in the people studied was not merely a coincidence. So it wasn't just like they randomly happened at the same time. That is also important to the argument. So I believe A is our best choice. Oh, yes. And also, if you notice typos, sorry, I have to type these over. So if you do misread something or you're not sure, feel free to ask me because I might have mistyped it. Purely a coincidence. Sure. So A is both alcohol abuse issues and depression can be solved via the use of therapy, specifically designed for the treatment of alcohol abuse issues. So the conclusion here is strictly that it must be the case that abusing alcohol causes depression. We're not really getting to the point of solving depression or alcohol abuse issues. That is outside the scope of this argument. We are specifically just talking about this cause and effect relationship. So A is not a necessary assumption. Does that clarify on A? And D, the study was not set up in a way such that people who were not suffering with depression would be very unlikely to participate. So they are taking this study and they're saying all of the study participants who had abused alcohol in the past 5 years were found to be suffering with depression. So say they had a study of like 100 people and 10 people had abused alcohol in the past 5 years and all 10 of those people were depressed. But then you found out that the way that they recruited people for the study was to like go to a therapist's office who specializes in depression, and it turns out like all 100 of the people were depressed, and they're just kind of like nitpicking this thing and saying that this is the cause, but really the only people participating were depressed people. So if they did that, then that would kind of weaken the conclusion would follow from this premise. But D is saying specifically that the study was not set up in a way such that that would happen. Okay. Yes. We're just talking about what causes the other, and A is talking about something in the future. So A is basically saying that only people with alcohol abuse have depression, and one therapy can resolve both. Yeah, it's saying that there's this solution, but like we're not really to the solution part. We're just to let's identify the cause. Uh, um, General difficulty. The first couple were, I believe, easy difficulty or maybe like low medium, because definitely one of them on the GRE is ranked a little bit harder than on the GMAT course. And then this one is a medium, and the next couple are going to be like hard difficulty. Why is B incorrect? B is saying that depression and alcohol abuse were not both the results of heavy use of illicit drugs. So it's saying this other cause, heavy use of illicit drugs, is not the cause of both of these things. And so by ruling out a plausible third cause of both, the conclusion is more supported. Because if they were both caused by a third thing, then the conclusion falls apart. You don't have to write anything down for these because you can always like refer back to them. But as far as like, do I recommend taking some notes when you do CR? Yes, I absolutely do. So like with this one, this is basically the notes I would take every time. Here's my argument. What are the parts? This. Um, Oh, yes. The question is saying accept, which you think that you will be clear on, but sometimes you do miss it. And so be careful with those. It's in all caps, but who's reading these questions, Sims, right? So just be very careful. All right. Let's go to the next one. And then I believe Sam was asking, yes, this next one will be a hard difficulty. So just FYI if it feels like it jumps a bit. Typically, I try to do like 2 or 3, but I also go off of like how fast you're solving them. So I also try to make sure like a certain percentage of people are kind of done. Not everyone wants to solve them in the poll, but yeah, I typically spend 2 or 3 minutes per question and then a couple minutes going over. On that, Vanessa, always check your question stem, but also like if you're going through them and you're like and you get to like, well, 2 answers seem right, and then you get to like, well, this 3rd answer seems right, I would definitely double check your question stem at that point, because if you're seeing like several that could be necessary assumptions, then perhaps it's just an accept question and you missed the accept. That's usually how I notice it, where I'm like, there's a lot of plausible answers here, and then I go back and I'm like, oh, okay, I'm looking for the opposite thing that I'm usually looking for. Homeownership, as opposed to renting a home, can have many benefits, both for individuals who own homes and for society as a whole. While fewer than 50% of the country's citizens own homes, the government does little to encourage home ownership. By doing more to encourage home ownership, by making people aware of the advantages home ownership has over renting, the government could improve conditions for both for individuals and for society in general. So, homeownership can have many benefits, both for individuals and society and for society. Fewer than 50% of the country's citizens own homes, and the government does little to encourage home ownership. So the conclusion is, if the government did more to encourage home ownership by making people aware of the advantages, then the government could improve conditions for both individuals and for society. I like this conclusion because it is an important structure to notice. Namely, it is an if then. So if the government does this, then this will happen. Whenever you see see if I can share these results. So notice whenever then, because that can really narrow down what's a necessary assumption, and I will show you what I mean. So, A, crime rates are lower in cities in which the ratio of homeowners to renters is relatively high because people who own homes tend to feel invested in their communities. This explains a premise, but we already know that homeownership can have many benefits. We don't really need to know why that is true. B, people involved in government are interested in improving conditions for individuals and society at large. This is not a necessary assumption because the conclusion is if the government does this, if they encourage homeownership, then conditions could improve. So we don't, if they don't, like if the government just does not care about improving conditions for individuals in society and they don't do this thing, then this argument isn't about them. So this is a popular trap answer but pay very close attention to what the conditions of your conclusion are, and sometimes you can lead these out. But yeah, B, we don't need to have them interested in improving conditions for the conclusion to be true. C, without government encouragement to buy homes, most people in the country will choose to rent the homes in which they live. This isn't a necessary assumption. This seems like more like it could be a conclusion of the argument, because if we negate it without government encouragement to buy homes, most people in the country will not choose to rent the homes in which they live. I mean, yeah, that's the argument just does not hinge on this. This is more like a summation of what could potentially be a conclusion for these facts. D, the post-retirement housing expenses of people who own homes are often lower than those of people who rent. This is also saying like, so A kind of says like, here's a reason why homeownership has benefits for society as a whole, and D is saying, here's a reason why homeownership has benefits for individuals, but we don't need to know either one because we already know that there are benefits. And E, some of the people who are currently renting homes or considering renting homes could afford to buy homes should they choose to do so. So, if this isn't true, and an important note here is that some people is like basically any amount of people, like at least one person and maybe all the people. It's a very broad term. But so the opposite of this is none of the people who are currently renting homes or considering renting homes could afford to buy homes should they choose to do so. If that was true, then this conclusion does not hold, because it doesn't matter how much the government tells people how great homeownership is if literally 0 people can afford to buy homes. They can tell them all day long, but like if you don't have the money, you don't have the money. So E is a necessary assumption. And we cross off B because interest is bidirectional. I'm not sure exactly what you mean about the bidirectional interest. If you would clarify that one. Oh, yes, I see. Yeah, kind of. I mean, people can have interest. So, um, people could be interested in improving conditions for individuals, but that doesn't mean that they're going to do it. And for choice B, and they could also be not interested in, they could have no like investment at all, but that doesn't mean they're not going to improve conditions for people. Maybe they're just, that doesn't cross their radar. So, one thing about C is, say that like most people in the country would choose to rent the homes in which they live without government encouragement. Um, yes. So that could still be true and they could still increase home ownership some. So even if like 90% of the people would choose to rent without government encouragement, then like there could still be some people that chose to buy. It's just like a little bit of a vague statement. And I definitely recommend you're trying to see what the impacts of statements are clearly. So that one just doesn't seem to have a super obvious impact to me. It would be hard for me to narrow it down. Um, does it D count as a benefit that the conclusion is talking about? D is, yeah, it's basically saying like, this is one way that homeownership could benefit individuals, but like we already know that that's true. So it's not a necessary assumption because we already know that. It's a trap answer that explains a premise or like supports a premise, but we don't need our premises supported. They're fine. We're already taking them as true. Same issue with A. It supports the premise that homeownership benefits society at large, but we don't need to support that premise. So we already know that it has benefits and we don't have to understand why. Let's see. For C, as far as the negation, the way I would do it would be without government encouragement to buy homes, most people in the country will not choose to rent the homes in which they live. Which is, and that's another kind of vague problem, because without government encouragement to buy homes, most people in the country will not choose to rent the homes in which they live. Like, what would that entail? Does that mean that they're buying them? Does that mean that they're not going to live here at all? It's just the negation on that one also has an equally sort of vague impact, and we're looking for more of a concrete impact. Shouldn't we look for most or many, as some will not have much of an impact, or when should we look for most in the answer? So there is a lesson in the TTP course that kind of breaks down like some versus many versus most. And I referenced that a lot when I was prepping because like there's not a clear answer of like many is always better than some or most is always better than many. It's not that clear. But you do want to understand that like most is more than half and perhaps all. Many is more than a few, but not necessarily more than half. But it also could be more than half and it could be all. And some is anywhere between like, it's any amount above 0%. So it could be 1%, it could be all the people, it could be anywhere in between. And so, especially for E, if you understand that some means, any amount of people, and you negate it and say that none of the people could afford to buy who are currently renting, it's easy to see that that kind of makes the conclusion collapse. So I wouldn't say one is always better than the other, but you do want to pay super close attention to which term is used because it can heavily impact like how much the statement affects the argument. Yeah, so anytime I would say for the interested question, Vanessa, so anytime an assumption says that they may be interested, um, I would definitely be cautious because like preferences usually don't like matter. Same thing with the fruit thing as far as like the taste, there's no difference in taste. Like if the conclusion isn't about like people's preference on taste, then we're just not concerned with that. So anytime we're talking about people's feelings, just make sure that the argument is about people's feelings or preferences because it so rarely is. Are answer choices that explain facts in the stimulus considered strengtheners? No, same sort of track. We don't have to strengthen premises to strengthen an argument because we already take them as true. Um, and same thing here. So anytime something like explains a premise, it's probably not going to be a good fit. Okay, let's see. And then identify. Yeah, the first thing that's very useful. Abby check. The first thing is to identify the difference between the premise and conclusion. That's your gap. And then identify the statement, which would have to be true to hold for the conclusion to hold up with that. When should I put the negotiate or the negation, for instance, in C? I typically, the choice for negation, like I see some people are doing like without to with, that one's usually a little bit blurry. To me, the place to put the negation is usually if it says people will do something, you switch it to they will not do it. That's the cleanest way to do it, because if you say like without government encouragement to buy homes, most people in the country will choose to rent. Then the opposite is with government encouragement to buy homes, most people in the country will choose to rent. And that's not really negating the same sentiment, because the action is the same and the cause is different, like with or without government encouragement, but we really want the action to be the opposite. So I would throw in most people will not choose to rent the homes and leave the without as it is. I have a couple of general questions. I had another question. We are running a little bit over. So I'm going to throw that up there in case anyone wants to do it, and then I will take these general questions, and then we can glance at it. Okay, someone asked me about my first mock test score and how much time I took to get to 805. That one is, so my first mock was like a 645, and then my second mock was my lowest. It was a 615. And it took me like 9 months to do all of my prep work to get to the 805. I did do all my mocks at the end, so I didn't do a baseline, which I definitely recommend you do a baseline. But I wanted to save all 6 of them for the end. So that was kind of, I got my 615, 645. I got those like after I was done with a lot of my studying. So if your initial mock was lower than that, then don't feel bad, because I had already studied and that was still the scores I was getting. And so I really just like to get from my 615, which was my lowest mock, to my 805. A lot of it was just like adjusting my approach and like fine tuning stuff. So it's not like I started at a 615 and you have to start at a 615. I had already done a lot of my prep. Heads up on that. And then doing this takes a lot of time. For easy questions, it's fine, but for medium or hard questions, it takes more than 3 or 4 minutes. I would say, depending on where you're at, Deepak, you will get practice, and that will speed you up a lot. So if you're, especially like if you're earlier on in the course, or like you've only done like assumptions and strengths and questions, then there's, as you go through the other question types, that will help you with your time some. And then the other thing I recommend is doing the breakdowns like I do them, because I know that it's annoying to write everything out, but it really helps you like make sure that you're seeing things clearly. And so yeah, it does add time to write things out, but it's easier to see like where you're missing things. And without doing that, without like really narrowing down on like what you're missing, it can be way harder to like focus your solutions. So I definitely recommend like writing things out. It will probably slow you up a couple of minutes, but then once you get better at it and you know that you can consistently like break down arguments, your time will improve from there quite a bit. Highest MOT score, I want to say, was like a 705. And my lowest was a 615. And I did. So yeah, did I do TTP from the 645 to the 805? I had done like all of TTP before I started doing my mocks. And then I just went back through and did like targeted review, also with TTP mostly, and like the reviewing the questions from the actual mocks on GMAT Club. And so yeah, I got my 645 at the end of TTP, and then I still had like some tweaks to do to like really fill in my gaps, and that's when I got to the 805. Yep. How many hours a week did I study? Typically like 15 to 20. And did I complete every single chapter test? There are so many. So mostly if there's like a couple per chapter, I did do them. Like if there's like 2 or 3, but definitely with some of the quant ones that have like 8 chapter tests, there were some chapters I did not do them all. And I really think it just depends on, like, especially when there's like 8 and you're going through them, are you like still getting stuff out of it? Are you like learning new things? Because if you're just like doing it to like force yourself to get through it, that might not be as useful. And I was also like, hey, if I do half of these, if I do 4 of these and there's 4 more and I want to do more later because I don't understand the concepts, I can come back. So that is also a choice. But if there's only like 1 or 2 chapter tests, I would definitely do all of them, because you do want to get a minimum amount of practice questions just to understand everything. Did I brainstorm? I mentioned in a video that I brainstorm all possible assumptions first without looking at the answer choices when I was practicing. I wouldn't say I brainstormed all possible assumptions, because that is a lot, but I would definitely, like, as I was reading, you kind of notice gaps. So like with that insurance one, you're going through and they're like, hey, we'll offer insurance to people without pre-existing conditions, and then the conclusion is like everyone will have insurance. I was definitely like, I mean, will they? Because there's a big old condition right here about pre-existing conditions. And so you do have to read critical reasoning questions a little bit, just like critically. Like you are looking for holes in the argument, whether you're strengthening it or weakening it or whatever. And so I definitely think it's good to read with a critical eye, because that is how you will find those assumption gaps. But you don't want to be too rigid with it, because you don't want to decide, like if I was like, oh, it's got to be like this thing about the pre-existing conditions, and then it was something else, I wouldn't want to be too rigid about that. But it's definitely good to notice when people are like, oh, here's this evidence, so I think that means that the conclusion is blah, blah, blah. Just anywhere where you're like, that seems like kind of a jump because of this, it's good to notice those gaps. I do that. Let's see. So my total was 9 months. Yes. And if you studied 8 hours a day for 2 months, honestly, like that seems like a significant amount, because I spent probably like 500-ish hours, a little bit more than that. And what is the best way to practice with quant? If I go over old questions, I can check my process with the videos. With verbal, my problem is I remember the correct answer. What you really want to do if you're going back over them is like make sure you're explaining it to yourself. So even if you do remember the correct answer and you go back and do the question again, like do what I'm doing is what I would do. Like I go through and I'm like, A says this and I don't like it for this reason, or it's vague or whatever. And then the correct answer would be like, oh, this addresses it because if I negate it, this. So even if you kind of remember what the correct answer is, you're still forcing yourself to be like, justify, 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 and you want to justify things. And then what tweaks did I make? Order of test. I did PI, quant, verbal, and that worked well for me because the graphs are hard for me to see. My eyes get tired, so I did DI first. And scrap paper organization, I cannot say that I had much of that. I am a very chaotic note taker. I don't recommend that you do that, but that is just how I take notes. So the best thing as far as like for your notes, I would just practice a lot and figure out what system works for you. And that's how I would do it. And then reducing time in CR, again, I definitely recommend taking notes and like making sure that you're clear on things. But there is a certain level of time reduction that does come naturally. Did I face any test anxiety? I faced a lot of anxiety leading up to the test. And then like the day of the test, I feel like I was just kind of like anxietied out, and I was like, oh well, like I guess this is how it's gonna go, which I had also prepped for a really long time, and so maybe I was just tired. But yeah, I had a lot of anxiety, and I tend to have anxiety about things, and I tend to over prepare for things, and I did a lot of preparation, and so like by the time I got to the test, I was like, I have done as much as I can do. And I cannot do any more, and so this has got to be like good enough because I don't have any more students for this. That's definitely something you could try. I'm also a big fan of like, I get really like physiologically uncomfortable before I notice like I'm reacting in an anxiety way. So it's good to check in and be like, oh, am I breathing really shallowly? Like, am I having like these physiological symptoms of stress or anxiety, and can I like interrupt that and take a minute and do some deep breaths? And I would say one thing that I learned a long time ago was like, you should take a moment when you're calm and like count how many breaths per minute you breathe and note it down. And then like later when you're like, am I angry or am I just like, are my shoulders just tense? Like try to breathe at that rate and see if it helps you. And that's a super easy thing to just do like in the test because it takes like a minute. Let me pop through this one super quick, and then if there are any more questions, you can drop them and I will answer them before we wrap. But yes, a recent and I'll share. Sorry. A recent study determined that MBA candidates who engaged experienced admissions consultants to help in the development of their applications were significantly more likely to be accepted into MBA programs than candidates who did not engage such consultants. Therefore, when applying to MBA programs, relatively wealthy applicants must have an advantage over non-wealthy applicants because experienced admissions consultants are costly and not all applicants can afford to utilize their services. So people who use these consultants did significantly better or were significantly more likely to be accepted into programs than those who didn't. Experienced consultants cost a lot of money, so they are unaffordable for some applicants, and relatively wealthy applicants can afford this costly service because that's how money works. So the conclusion is wealthy applicants have an advantage over non-wealthy applicants when applying to MBA programs. Let's go through it. MBA candidates willing to make significant financial investments in their applications are not generally more motivated to earn high grades and scores than candidates unwilling to make such investments. So they're saying that wealthy candidates have an advantage, and A is saying these people are not generally more motivated to earn higher scores or high grades and scores than candidates unwilling to make such an investment. If we negate this, and the people that are willing to make a significant financial investment, regardless of how wealthy they are also more motivated to earn high grades and scores than candidates unwilling to make such an investment, then the conclusion doesn't super follow because it might not be a wealth advantage. It might just be that the cause is like motivation, and the motivation makes them hire consultants, but it also makes them get like other high grades and scores that make them more competitive applicants. So A is necessary. B, experienced admissions consultants help candidates applying to MBA programs develop stronger applications than those candidates would ever be able to develop on their own. This explains a premise. We already know that people who hire consultants are significantly more likely to be accepted, so we do not need to know why that is true. C, MBA admissions officers who review candidates' applications are not able to determine whether a candidate has engaged an experienced admissions consultant to help in the development of an application. This is seemingly relevant, but it actually doesn't matter for the same reason, because we already know that wealthy candidates have this advantage as far as being like significantly more likely, or candidates that hire consultants are significantly more likely to be accepted. Whether or not the adcoms can tell, the fact is that those hiring consultants are significantly more likely to be accepted. So that one is more just like distracting, but it is not a necessary assumption. D, experienced admissions consultants have valuable insider information regarding what MBA programs are and are not seeking in the applicants, which they pass along to their clients. That one also just seems to like explain that same premise. We already know that they are significantly more likely to be accepted. And E, experienced admissions consultants often engage in pro bono work involving their helping applicants to MBA programs develop their application at little to no cost. That is a weakener. And also, it kind of argues with the premise about admissions consultants are costly. It's not necessarily directly contradicting that, because you can have like a high hourly rate and do pro bono work, but it's not a necessary assumption. It is a weakener at best. So. Yeah, I get asked about this one a lot, so that's usually why I include it. So A is our best choice on that one. And then, yes, how was my experience at CVS? Which CVS are we talking about? How can you tell the difference between identifying a background versus a premise? Don't worry about that. I do it that way because that's how I like to do it, but a lot of people have a hard time. So I will explain the difference. Background is like something that's for context, and a premise is like a support for the argument. And sometimes it's hard to, like, the line's a little bit blurry between the two. So like if you had an argument and it says like, oh, like whatever, Quinn's is a bakery in Chattanooga, and then Quinn's uses only all organic flour and blah blah blah. The Chattanooga part is background, like it's just setting the scene. Or if it says like Quinn's is one of 3 bakeries in Chattanooga, like it's really just there to give you some context for what's going on. But premises and background information are both always 100% true, and they are both like considered supporting evidence. So if you have a hard time separating them out, I just tell people just segregate supporting evidence from the conclusion. And if you do that, you are fine, because one has to be true and the other one does not. So you really want to take the pile of everything that has to be true and put it over together, and then you want to take the conclusion, and it's the thing that we can mess with. And you could also say like background doesn't necessarily lead to the conclusion, whereas a premise ostensibly should. But yeah, I consider background kind of context, but there's definitely some stuff that could go like either way, especially on the shorter arguments. Can I explain A again? So it's saying that people, well, our conclusion is wealthy applicants have an advantage over non-wealthy applicants when applying to MBA programs. what A is saying is that these people that are willing to spend a lot of money on, in this case, admissions consultants, are not generally more motivated to earn high grades and scores. So they're not generally more motivated to earn other things that would make their application more appealing. So if we negate this, and they are also generally more motivated to get a good GMAT score or get high grades, then it might not be the wealth that's conferring the advantage. It might just be that people happen to be more motivated. Those people happen to be both hiring admissions consultants and turning in like 3-pronged strong applications, basically. And that is why that's a necessary assumption, because whenever an author is saying like, oh, the cause is, in this case, like being wealthy, the effect is you have like an extra advantage. They're assuming that there's no other causes going on, but if the cause is actually like motivation and not necessarily wealth, then their conclusion doesn't hold up. And someone said B made the most sense. B is, I think, like a fairly popular choice on this one. And this is like a pretty hard level question. So the gaps between the wrong and the right answer are a little bit narrow. But the problem with B is it doesn't really give us new information. It explains a premise, but it doesn't. We don't need that. Like, we already know that their applications are stronger if we're assuming that like people with strong applications get accepted. So the fact that these consultants allow them to build applications that are way better than they could build without the help of consultants, I mean, we don't actually have to know that, because we already know that people that hire consultants have an advantage as far as being accepted. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, but wealthy or not wealthy, both are applying to the business school. One, will you clarify on that one? I'm not 100% I'm following you. So A says because of motivation, non-wealthy applicants would be willing to pay. Yeah, so maybe they're just, yes, consultants are expensive. Yes. So they're saying wealthy people have an advantage, but there's also this factor that, like, what if average, like, non-wealthy people are so motivated to get into business school that they're also like shelling out these high prices for consultants because they're motivated? So it's too generalistic to assume that it's only the wealthy. That perhaps like they're saying only wealthy people have an advantage because who would spend more than X% of their income or assets on a consultant? But like some people, the percentage is way higher and they're not particularly wealthy, but like they will spend all the money they have on a consultant just because like they really want to get into the school, if that makes sense. Oh, I am going to Copenhagen Business School, but I have not started yet. So I won't be starting till in a couple of months. So I will have to keep you posted because I don't have that much feedback yet, but they seem super nice so far. They have a lovely visa program and it's a very nice city. Did I miss? Let's see here. So the best way to study for verbal is by understanding all the different types of verbal questions and identifying the trap choices. Honestly, like, yes, the best thing I think you can do is obviously understand the different types of questions. That's super helpful. But also, like, learning the trap choices. And the thing is, there's a lot for like each type of question, usually like 5 or 6 trap type answers, but there is a ton of overlap. And if you kind of spot them, so like the ones that explain the premise, that one comes up in a lot of question types. Weakeners on strengthen questions and assumption questions, and strengtheners on weaken questions. Almost always at least one will have that. So there's like, if you can just learn those traps, and then when you're going through and you're like, I don't know which one it is, and you're like, well, which of the 4 or 5 ways that they trick you on this question type can I spot, that can help you rule out some trap answers. And then the other important thing about studying for verbal is to just be like so nitpicky about how you read things. Just like you have to be so careful about the words used, because they can have like a big shift as far as what we're looking for. Let's see here. You can't take for granted that students engaging consultants have stronger application. Maybe consultants can influence the management of business school in some other way. It could be that, but what we know from statistics is just that the people that are hiring the consultants are more likely to be accepted. So it could be that the consultants are influencing management in some other way, but what we know for sure is that the people that are hiring consultants are getting accepted at higher rates. Yes, I will be here typically about once a week, though it kind of depends on marketing. And I am trying to kind of follow the course, one, because that's how I learned, and 2, because I think it's a very like logical fit. So I typically try to do the lessons kind of in order. So I'm doing assumptions, and then next week I'll probably try to do weaken the argument, just because I think that that's how I learned it. So I think that's the right way to learn it, and that's the best way I can teach it. I do hope I enjoyed grad school. Are there other, and I hope that all of you enjoy grad school too. So keep in touch. Are there other sources to supplement our understanding of verbal questions that you recommend? It's kind of up to you, Daniel. But one thing that I think is super helpful that we touch on in the TTP course, but like you can brush up on it on your own really easily, and I think you get a lot of bang for your buck, is to go through and learn about the logical fallacies that come up a lot, like whatever the top 10 ones are, false dichotomy, things like that. Because you will see those patterns so much in these arguments, and you can read up on them. You can spend like 20 minutes one day and then review the next week for 20 minutes, the like top 10 logical fallacies that come up, and you will notice those patterns so often. I just think it's a really useful thing to do. A lot of people also like to use the LSAT books. I did not do so much of the LSAT, and I do think that it covers more as far as the logical fallacies go. But you do have to be a little bit careful, because some of their stuff, they do extra stuff. They do like the significant assumptions, and we aren't worried about that. So if you use the LSAT books, you should know that these questions are typically, they're a little bit simpler. There's like a few less things that we're worried about, but a lot of people do have a lot of luck with that. But I think you're better off working on fewer critical reasoning questions and just like really getting into them, like really drilling down, than you are like having extra practice questions and not dissecting them so thoroughly. And you can absolutely use GMAT Club. They have real good filters as far as like, you can filter by OG, you can filter by how difficult the question is, all that stuff. And just, there's usually, especially for the OG questions, there's usually quite a few explanations, and people can vote on them. So, you know, if they're not good, people will downvote them. And I also get on there sometimes and just like try to break down arguments exactly like this, because I think that that's helpful. And also, GMAT Club will have your tests, like your OG mock questions will be on GMAT Club. So it's good to get familiar with it just for that, because they do not explain to you on your mocks why things are wrong. And if you don't know why they're wrong, then that can be really frustrating. Yeah, when you approach a new question, take notes and then kind of follow the process from TTP. Yeah, I mean, the TTP process is it's pretty basic as far as just like, hey, read the argument, understand the argument, like break it into its components, make sure you identify the conclusion. You should be doing all of those things. You might not break it down in exactly those steps, but it's obviously there to like teach you how, as if you know nothing. And so a lot of times people are like, this seems really basic. I don't know if I need to break it down this much. But like as long as you're hitting the beats and you're identifying your conclusions and you're like consistent about it, you should be good. Did I use ChatGPT? I did not use ChatGPT in my prep. And I know that students do. And so typically, like, I also answer some of the questions about like these questions on our little like help me chat. And sometimes students will like send me stuff and then be like, ChatGPT said this. It's pretty good at some things, but it misses some concepts that are really core. And one of the ones that it misses is like ChatGPT cannot seem to grasp that you cannot argue with a premise. I don't know what it is about it, but it is a pattern I notice a lot. Or anything where it's like a study. So, like this example, a recent study determined, it just like, it will try to poke holes in a study all the time. It just can't help itself. So while ChatGPT, I think, is super cool and useful in a lot of ways, be careful with CR. If you're unclear, like get a second opinion. If it says something weird, you can always message me and I will look at it and tell you if it seems like off for some reason. But you do have to be, it's such a cool tool, but it's also like, be careful, which I'm sure you've all heard 1,000 times, but I'm going to say it here. Here is my email in case you did have any questions. This one, if we negate A, it would mean that rich applicants are equally motivated as not so rich applicants, thus diminishing the role of consultants in their selection. Yeah, you could say that. It's the distinction with this one, I think, is like motivation is different than wealth. And so if you see like, if we take the wealth out of it and we're talking about like, what if it was just motivation that was causing the difference, then that is a different cause and effect. Well, a different cause, same effect. Yeah, and that's kind of, you're right, Stalin. AI is super great as long as you know enough about it to know when it's wrong. But if you don't know enough about it to be like if you're really unsure, I don't know if I would trust its advice. Did I use flashcards? Yes. The flashcard thing that I think is the most helpful is, though I'm not like a super big flashcard person, so take that with a grain of salt, but they're super good for memorizing formulas. And the other thing they're super good for is like if you always miss something, like if you always miss, I always miss difference of squares. And I see the problem and I'm just like, I just see it and I'm mad. And I'm like, I don't want to do all this. And then later it's a difference of squares. So what I did was I had a flashcard that was like an equation or two that was like difference of squares, and on the back it just said like, it's a difference of squares, Julia, so that I would stop missing it every time. Or like some like easy conversions as far as like going from decimal to approximate fraction and that making it way easy. If you miss those kind of like tricks to solve quant, it's super helpful to write those down just to remind yourself, because you will be stressed and you'll just see like something and be like, I don't want to fill up my whole page with like this math. And there's probably like a trick that you're missing. So the flashcards are super cool. Can I give you an estimate that this much questions you must try for quant of moderate or hard levels before sitting for final? It varies a little bit person to person. I would say, and I know that this is not helpful, but it's really like, it's the most honest I could be. It's kind of a vibes thing. Like, if you are doing them and like you just don't feel good about it and you put it down for a couple of days and you come back and you still don't feel good about it, keep practicing. If you're doing them and you don't feel good about it and then you put it down for a couple of days and you come back and you're like, oh, like with some space and a little bit less stress, I'm able to kind of see what's going on, then you're probably getting closer to done with that topic. But I wouldn't want to tell you, oh, like do 100 problems about like the circle formula of whatever, and then you did 100 and that just like wasn't quite enough for you, or you did 50 and then you already understood and you made yourself do another 50 because I said that. Go like check in with yourself, because it's going to be a little bit different for everyone, and what you're going for is that like you have a good understanding. But I would, like I said before, I would at least do like a couple of the chapter tests for everything, which is the equivalent of, say, like 30 to 40 questions plus the ones in the lesson. So that is a good, at each level. So that is a good idea for broad concepts, just so you have one. You said we should avoid ChatGPT during our prep, but what about AI tools sent to our TTP course? The AI in the TTP I actually work on, which is why I know a little bit more about this than I did, because I did not use very much like AI during my prep, and then now I'm kind of helping train our AI, and our AI is pretty good. It's much better than just like generic AI on this stuff. You do still have to be a little bit careful on stuff, and that is why, please, if you see something and you're like not 100% sure, then you can always check with me. But ours is very much like, I personally spend a lot of time like trying to train it to make it more accurate, and it's also like almost entirely fed on, you know, official guide questions and our questions and like the basic structures and stuff. So it's way more focused, but it still can sometimes have a bit of an issue with particularly like the study thing. There is a couple of things where if you don't feel confident, please check with me. Don't trust the AI blindly. I would rather you check with me. But I would also highly recommend our AI over any like generic AI that isn't entirely composed of these critical reasoning examples and reading comp stuff. But is this true? Most questions are going to be from hard level. Most questions probably won't be hard. I would say, like, there's a pretty even breakdown. I wouldn't say I had more than 8 or so hard questions in any of my sections, because there's a cap on how many they'll give you for like timing reasons. And so don't skimp on your easy and medium because you think all the questions will be hard, because that is straight up not going to happen. If the section is 23 questions, they aren't giving you 23 hard questions. They don't have that many ready for you. I would say it's a pretty even breakdown if you're doing like pretty well, and then if you have a few that you miss, you might get a certain skew towards medium or so. I do use Copilot AI during prep. It's more authentic. Oh, interesting. I will have to check. All right. Did I miss any questions? Anything else? I'm trying to apply the street method with assumptions, but I finished the OG. Would you recommend? Yeah, if you finish the OG, then like I think the LSAT questions are good, because the way I understand it, which I've only kind of like glanced at them, but just talking to other students, I think that they're very like they're written by people that have a really strict understanding of like argument structure, and so they're acting that way. Like they're very clean. Like they fully understand that the premise is always supported. Like they have a clear conclusion. They have a clear idea of assumptions. Whereas just like some of the random stuff on GMAT Club might not be as strong, but they have some LSAT stuff on there too, I'm pretty sure. Did I hire any admissions consultant for the admissions process? No, I did not do that. I did all my applications myself. I'm also kind of like learning a bit more about the admissions consultant thing, but because we're also doing like a bit of an admissions consultant course, we're working on that a little bit at TTP, so I help a little bit on that. And it does seem like kind of a neat idea. I navigated all my applications myself, and I will say like it was an exhausting process. But I also, I guess when I'm applying for things like this or a job or whatever, and I'm old also, so keep that in mind, and maybe I'm just jaded, but I'm really trying to find places where like I'll personally be a good fit. So like I don't necessarily like worry so much about, oh, I have to work at like a certain company or whatever. Like I don't have a lot of that. If you do, then definitely an admissions consultant might help you out with getting like a very specific placement at a very specific school or something. But for me, like what I'm mostly looking at is like, hey, this is what I'm like. Is that what you're looking for? Like, is that gonna work well? And so I really wanted to write my own essays just because I wanted to be like, hey, this is how I am. So like if that's what you're looking for, awesome. And I'm sure that I'll do great. And if that is not what you're looking for, then perhaps that's not like a great place for me. And so to make up for that, I had to do like a few more applications. Can we use Chat GPT for editing our essays? I honestly think Chat GPT is probably pretty good for like a lot of stuff. I do know that people are a little bit, I know a lot of people in academia and they hate ChatGPT and they complain about it all the time. And so a lot of them might like scan the essays. I would definitely not just like throw it into ChatGPT and then like copy paste it over because they're scanning for that and they're so judgmental. It's their favorite thing to complain about. But I do think it could be helpful just for like if you wrote out your essay and you were like, hey, here's what I'm looking for, here's some examples. Can you tweak it to be like this? Or like, I'm looking at this school, like, here's some stuff about their culture, here's what I'm interested in. Can you tweak it from there? I think it could save you a bunch of time. Just make sure that you're kind of like polishing it from there. It is like if you have scored so high and you go to these consultants, they may give you more discount. You know what? That's a cool idea for now. I'm a little bit late in the process, but I should have thought about it like that. Did I write the business writing assessment? I didn't because I don't think it was out yet. It might have been like brand new out, but I took the focus in, I want to say May, and GMAT 10, GMAT Classic, had just like stopped being offered at, I want to say, the end of February. So I took the focus and it had just rolled out, at least here, like it rolled out some places early. I don't even think the writing assessment was out until after I took the focus. I want to say it came out in like June or July because they used to have the writing on the old GMAT and then they got rid of it and then now it's like a separate thing and it costs $40 extra. And is it recommended? Like, do you want, so you do a certain level of like writing for your essays, and I think that can be kind of a writing sample, which I also think is what the GMAT was thinking when they got rid of the writing, and then people were kind of like, can I have more writing? But I do know it's required at a couple of schools, definitely Harvard off the top of my head. and I want to say 2 or 3 other M7s, and then perhaps a few other places. Is it recommended? Check with your school, because if one of them requires it, well, you might as well do it. And if none of them care, then I wouldn't necessarily worry about it. I didn't apply to Harvard or Stanford because they would not. They don't waive application fees, and they're like really expensive, and so I was like, I don't think that like I want to do this enough to apply. And so I filled out the Stanford application, but I just didn't submit it. And I've also I've lived a lot of places, and I'm like really picky about where I live. Um but yeah, like California is great and I definitely recommend it, but like I have lived there before and it wasn't super like where I was trying to move right now and stuff like that. But it doesn't mean that they're not great schools. I'm a big culture fit person, and I'm also a big weather person, so all things to consider. I'm happy to hang out and answer questions, and also if you think of questions later, you have my email, so please hit me up with that. If you have questions about the course or whatever, fine. If you have questions about in general the process, also fine. But if you guys are all wrapped up, then I guess we can wrap it up. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. Sorry I went a bit over. All right. Hopefully I will see you next week to do Week in the Argument. So appreciate you all. You have a great weekend.